What's good, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Before we jump in, I want to give a huge shout out to all of you who've been engaging with the content, leaving thoughtful comments, and sharing your own perspectives on these histories we explore together. Your insights make this work so much richer. Now, today, we're diving into a question that might seem straightforward on the surface, but opens up into something far more complex, and, honestly, somewhat unsettling the more you examine it. We're asking, who writes African history? And I don't just mean that in the abstract sense of which scholars put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard. I'm talking about who controls the narrative, who publishes these narratives, where these books get printed and distributed, and ultimately, who gets to decide what the official story of Africa actually is. This matters because history isn't just a collection of facts about the past. History is power. History shapes how we understand ourselves, how we're understood by others, and what futures we can even imagine as possible. So when we ask who writes African history, we're really asking, who has the power to define Africa's place in the world? I should say up front that I'm coming at this as someone who spent considerable time studying African historiography. That's the study of how history gets written, and I've been troubled by patterns that keep emerging. Patterns of external control, of narratives shaped by non-African interests, of publishing systems that still, in 2025, funnel African stories through foreign gatekeepers. This video is my attempt to map out how we got here, and, more importantly, where we might go from here. But I am not claiming to have all the answers. This is a conversation, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts, especially if you're working in African universities, publishing houses, or educational systems. All right, so let's begin by establishing some historical context, because you can't understand the present situation without knowing how African historiography developed over time. For most of recorded history, Africa's past was documented primarily through oral traditions maintained by griots in West Africa, by oral historians across the continent, and through various forms of cultural memory embedded in art, ritual, and social structures. This wasn't a deficiency. It was a sophisticated system of knowledge preservation that worked extraordinarily well for African societies. Early written accounts of Africa were almost entirely produced by outsiders. Ancient and classical writers from Greece and Rome wrote unsystematically about parts of Africa. Islamic and Arabic scholars produced more substantial accounts of African states and societies, which have proven valuable for modern historians, though they reflected their authors' own perspectives and interests. Then came the Europeans, traders, missionaries, explorers, and colonial administrators. And this is where African historiography took a profoundly damaging turn. These European writers weren't just documenting what they saw. They were actively constructing narratives that served colonial interests. They propagated theories like the Hamitic hypothesis, which claimed that anything impressive in African civilization must have been created by lighter-skinned people from outside Africa. They created a whole body of literature arguing that Africa had no history worth studying before European contact. The philosopher Hegel infamously declared that Africa was no historical part of the world and had no movement or development to exhibit. Can you imagine the audacity? An entire continent written off as static and historyless. But this wasn't just academic musing. This became the intellectual justification for colonialism. If Africans had no history, no civilization, no development of their own, then European colonization could be framed as bringing progress and civilization to a benighted land. So when we talk about who wrote African history in the colonial period, the answer is clear. Europeans wrote it for European audiences to serve European interests. And they did so with institutional backing. Universities, publishing houses, libraries, all the machinery of knowledge production was under their control. The mid-20th century brought a profound shift. As African nations fought for and won independence, there was a parallel movement to decolonize African history itself. African scholars weren't just going to accept the degrading narratives that had been imposed on their continent. They were going to write their own histories, using their own methods, centering African voices and African sources. In Nigeria, Kenneth Onwuka Dike, often called the father of modern African historiography, revolutionized the field. He demonstrated that African history could be reconstructed using a combination of written archives and oral traditions. He became the first African director of a history department at University College Ibadan in 1956. His approach inspired what became known as the Ibadan School of History. Other scholars followed. Jacob Ade Ajayi worked on Yoruba history. Bethwell Allen Ogot became the leading historian in East Africa. Cheikh Anta Diop in Senegal produced revolutionary work arguing for the African origins of Egyptian civilization. Joseph Kizerbo from Burkina Faso became a towering figure in African historical scholarship. These weren't just academics. They were intellectual warriors fighting to reclaim African history from colonial distortion. The methodological innovation these scholars brought cannot be overstated. They argued forcefully that oral traditions, when subjected to rigorous critical analysis, were legitimate historical sources. They brought in archaeology, historical linguistics, ethnography, anthropology, creating what one scholar called the decathlon of social sciences. By the 1970s, a generation of African historians had produced doctoral dissertations and published works that fundamentally transformed the field. For the first time, African history was being written primarily by Africans. As historian Catherine Kokery-Vidrovich noted, for the past 4 decades, African history has been written principally by African historians, and wariness of their writings is no longer tenable. In 1964, something remarkable happened. UNESCO launched the General History of Africa project, an attempt to produce a comprehensive history of the entire African continent from an African perspective. The project involved more than 350 experts, with the International Scientific Committee, composed of 2/3 African members. Scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop, Joseph Kizerbo, Theophile Obenga, and Ali Mazrui contributed. 8 volumes were published between 1981 and 1993, covering Africa from prehistory to the contemporary period, in multiple languages including English, French, Arabic, and even Kiswahili, Hausa, and Fulfulde. The significance of this project cannot be overstated. For the first time, there was a comprehensive history of Africa written primarily by African scholars, using African sources and centering African perspectives. It rejected colonial periodization that divided African history according to European contact. It incorporated oral traditions as legitimate sources. But here's what's important to understand. While it represented a major achievement in African scholars writing African history, it was still published and distributed through UNESCO, an international organization headquartered in Paris. The content was African, but the infrastructure remained external. Where do we stand today, in 2025? The answer is complicated. On one hand, African historians are now the primary producers of African historical scholarship. Major universities across the continent have strong history departments staffed by African scholars producing rigorous research. Contemporary historians like Mamadou Diop, Elikia Mbokolo, and Olivette Otele are doing groundbreaking work. Younger scholars are expanding the field. Women's history, environmental history, urban history, digital history. Between the 1980s and 2000s, African universities produced an impressive number of master's and doctoral dissertations, most unpublished, unfortunately, but representing a massive body of knowledge created by African scholars. But there are persistent structural problems that undermine African control over African historical narratives. Let's talk about where African history books actually get published, because this is where things get uncomfortable. Despite decades of independence, the majority of books about African history are still published by European and North American houses. Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press, James Curry Publishers, Routledge, Ohio University Press, all based in the global north, all controlled by non-African entities. Some publishers do important work and have relationships with African scholars. Ohio University Press has co-publishing arrangements with African presses to produce affordable editions. But the fundamental power dynamic remains. African scholars often write their books, but foreign publishers decide what gets published, how it's marketed, who gets access, and what the price point is. The textbook situation is even more troubling. After independence, African governments needed educational materials in massive quantities. Where did they turn? International publishers. Companies like Oxford University Press, Macmillan, Pearson, multinational corporations became the dominant suppliers of textbooks to African schools. Even when textbooks were Africanized in content, they were often still produced by subsidiaries of these international companies. There are structural reasons for this. Publishing requires infrastructure, printing presses, distribution networks, capital investment, marketing expertise. Many African countries didn't have this infrastructure well developed at independence, or it was destroyed by economic crises and structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s. International aid policies made things worse, systematically favoring large foreign publishers over smaller African ones through competitive bidding requirements. The result? African publishing houses have struggled to survive. Some have shut down entirely. Others exist in perpetually marginal positions. This isn't because African publishers are incompetent. It's because the global publishing infrastructure is tilted heavily toward the global north. There are efforts to address this. The African Books Collective, founded in 1989 and based in Oxford, is a non-profit collective owned by African publishers, enabling more than 150 African publishers to reach international markets. But notice the location: Oxford. Even infrastructure meant to help African publishers is headquartered outside Africa. There are independent African publishers doing remarkable work. Masobi Books in Nigeria, Jahazi Press in Nairobi, Mojaji Books in South Africa, Cassava Republic. These remain relatively small operations compared to multinational publishers. And here's a crucial point. Most independent African publishers focus on literary fiction and contemporary nonfiction. The academic history textbooks, the books that shape how African history is taught in schools, are still predominantly produced by international publishers. This brings us to what African history actually gets taught in African schools. Because it's one thing for African scholars to produce excellent research, but if that research doesn't make it into textbooks, what's the point? UNESCO has been trying to address this through its pedagogical use of the General History of Africa project, launched in 2009 to incorporate the UNESCO volumes into school curricula across Africa. In 2024, they held workshops with education ministries in Ghana, Gambia, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. This is important work. But let's be clear, more than 60 years after the General History of Africa project launched, African countries are still struggling to incorporate African-centered historical narratives into their own school curricula. That's how deeply entrenched colonial educational structures remain. There's also the language question. Most African historical scholarship is written in English or French, the colonial languages. It's the language of the academy, the language that gets you published in prestigious journals. But it means much. African historical scholarship is not directly accessible to most Africans. There's another subtle but important way African history remains influenced by external frameworks. Periodization. How we divide history into periods shapes how we understand historical change. African history has traditionally been periodized according to European contact. Pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. Notice what that does? It makes European intervention the central organizing principle. African history becomes defined by its relationship to Europe. Historian Ihediwa Nkemjika Chimi has argued this periodization needs restructuring to reflect African experiences and timelines. But changing periodization is hard. It requires consensus among scholars, rewriting textbooks, rethinking how we organize knowledge. And as long as major publishers and journals are based in the global north, there's inertia toward maintaining existing frameworks. Here's where I want to be balanced. Yes, there has been genuine progress. The proportion of African history written by African historians has increased dramatically. African universities produce high-quality research. Women historians from Africa, scholars like Jacqueline Bethel Mugue, Olivette Otel, Madina Thiam, Bolanle Awe, are expanding our understanding of African women's histories. The African Economic History Network has produced an open-access textbook specifically for African students and teachers. Digital technologies are creating new possibilities for African scholars to share work directly, bypassing traditional gatekeepers. But we also need honesty about persistent problems. African universities remain critically underfunded. Many of the continent's best historians have migrated to universities in Europe and North America because that's where the resources are. The 1980s saw a massive brain drain as economic crises devastated African higher education. That brain drain continues. African publishing houses remain marginal in the global ecosystem. Textbook production is dominated by international companies. Copyright enforcement is weak. Libraries are underfunded. And perhaps most fundamentally, the international academic system, journals, presses, conferences, citation networks, remains centered in the global north. Now let's address whether external influence continues to distort African history. The answer is, it's complicated, but yes, in important ways. The crude colonial-era distortions, the Hamitic hypothesis, the claim that Africa had no history, have been thoroughly debunked. African agency, African civilization, African complexity are now givens in serious scholarship. But more subtle distortions persist. When publishing is controlled by foreign companies, certain books get published and others don't. Publishers make decisions based on what will sell to their primary market: European and North American universities. African history books that fit into existing Western academic debates get published. Books that would resonate more with African audiences but seem too specialized get rejected. Even when books are written by African authors, they often need to explain African contexts to presumed non-African readers, anticipate Western misconceptions, engage with Western theoretical frameworks to be taken seriously. This isn't necessarily bad, but it does mean African historical scholarship is still often oriented toward external audiences and validation. The language question compounds this. When African history is written in English and French for international audiences, it's less accessible to African publics who might most benefit. And when African historians write primarily for international journals, they're incentivized to focus on topics that interest international scholars rather than questions more urgent for African societies. Your final question is perhaps most important. When can Africans claim sole responsibility for writing their own narratives? On one level, Africans have already claimed that responsibility. African scholars are the leading authorities on African history. When major debates happen, African historians are central participants. Contemporary research is predominantly produced by African historians. But if we're talking about full control over the entire apparatus of historical knowledge production, writing, publishing, distributing, teaching, archiving, we're not there yet. Not because African scholars lack capability, but because global infrastructure remains centered in the global north. Moving toward fuller African control requires several things. First, substantial investment in African publishing infrastructure, capital for printing presses, distribution networks, digital platforms, paying African editors, designers, marketers properly. Second, strengthening African universities and research institutions, funding for faculty salaries, research grants, libraries, archives, retaining African scholars on the continent, creating robust doctoral programs. Third, rethinking curricula. African countries need to deliberately center African history in education, use textbooks from African publishers when possible, teach in African languages where appropriate. Fourth, support for African publishing through government policies favoring local publishers, foundations supporting publishers as cultural infrastructure, African readers choosing African publishers. Fifth, and perhaps most fundamentally, a shift in how African societies value history. If history is seen as peripheral, it won't receive needed resources. But if understood as fundamental to identity, to development, to understanding challenges and imagining possibilities, it becomes a priority worth investing in. There's reason for hope in digital technologies. Online publishing, print on demand, e-books. These potentially allow African publishers to bypass infrastructure disadvantages. Open access models allow scholars to share work directly. Digital archives make sources more accessible. The African Books Collective has increasingly moved toward digital formats. Individual scholars create podcasts, YouTube channels, blogs sharing historical knowledge directly. Social media allows conversations about African history that cross borders and bypass gatekeepers. But we should be realistic. Digital technologies create new possibilities, but also new dependencies on internet infrastructure, electricity, devices, platforms controlled by Silicon Valley companies. The digital divide means many Africans lack reliable internet access. So digital technologies are part of the solution, not the whole solution. If you care about African history, there are things you can do. Support African publishers. When you have a choice, choose the African publisher. Yes, it might be harder to get, might be more expensive, but that's why they need support. Engage with African historians. Read their work. Follow them. Share their insights. They're producing remarkable research, but often lack platforms their Western counterparts have. If you're an educator, think critically about whose work you're assigning. Are you predominantly assigning Western scholars about Africa, or African scholars writing about their own continent? If you're a student, especially an African student, consider where you pursue degrees. International training can be valuable, but also consider strong African universities, contributing to building the next generation of scholarship on the continent. If you can fund or support African universities, publishing houses, archives, or historical societies, do it. These institutions are starved for resources and doing vital work. To directly answer your questions, who writes African history? Increasingly, African historians, though external influence remains significant. Where are history books designed and published? Still predominantly in the global north, though there are growing numbers of African publishers. Is African history still influenced by others in ways that distort it? Yes, in subtle but significant ways, through control of publishing, through academic system structures, through language choices, through what gets funded and ignored. When can Africans claim sole responsibility for their narratives? They've already begun. That process has been ongoing since the mid-20th century. But full control over the entire infrastructure of historical knowledge production is still a work in progress, requiring deliberate investment, institutional building, and collective commitment. This isn't a story with a simple ending. It's an ongoing process requiring vigilance, resources, and commitment. But it's also a story of remarkable achievement, of African scholars who, against considerable odds, have transformed our understanding of African history and continue groundbreaking work. I'm curious what you all think. If you're familiar with African publishing or education systems, what's your experience? Do you see signs of progress? What obstacles remain? How do we build toward a future where African history is fully controlled by Africans, told by Africans, published by Africans, for African audiences first and the world second? Let me know in the comments. All in all, this is a critical conversation for anyone who cares about knowledge, power, and who gets to tell the stories that shape how we understand ourselves. The struggle for African control over African history is far from over. But it's a struggle worth waging, and the progress made so far gives reason for hope alongside the challenges that remain. As always, I appreciate you being here for these conversations. If you found this valuable, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with anyone who might be interested. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep questioning whose stories we tell and how we tell them.